Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending the fourth panel of the Ships in the Proletarian Night conference, Capital Today, Super Exploitation, Profit and Finance. So before introducing the speakers, I'll run through some household rules and explain the format of this session. I'm going to ask you to all leave your cameras off and mute yourselves. And you can, of course, turn your camera on and unmute yourself when asking a question for the Q&A. To ask a question, please use the raise hand option or the chat. You can also activate the live transcript, although we're not to be held accountable for the accuracy. It's not entirely accurate. Do also please bear in mind that the session is being recorded for a personal archive, but wouldn't be published online. Two of this panel speakers have pre-circulated their papers, Niamh Mulcahy and Ariane Hanemaayer. I will firstly ask them to give a brief summary of their argument and will ask them a few questions. Andy Higginbottom has chosen to present his paper in the session. Once he presented, the floor will be open for questions and discussion. So let me first introduce the speakers. Niamh Mulcahy is an Alice Tsong Chi Research Fellow at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, CRASH, and at Lucy Cavendish College, Cambridge. She is interested in economic sociology, and she works in the critical tradition of political economy. The focus of her work is on finance-led economic growth and the financialization of household income. She's particularly interested in the widening of class-based inequality and the problem of financial exclusion, when individuals and households struggle to access necessary financial services or make use of them within their means. Her forthcoming book, Class and Inequality in a Time of Finance, draws on Foucault's theory of the subject alongside Althusser's understanding of class to consider the constraints of low income and precarious work on financial planning and household reproduction. And today she's presenting on aleatory materialism and the structural production of contemporary inequality. Ariane Hanemaayer is Associate Professor of Sociology at Brandon University, Canada, and Visiting Fellow at the Center for Research in Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, CRASH. Her work uses a genealogical approach to investigate the intersecting relationships among medical epistemology, healthcare systems and spaces, algorithmic decision-making technology, and medical governance and regulation. And she's especially interested in decentering the human as the object of inquiry in contemporary thought. And today she's presenting a paper entitled, Is the Bioeconomy a Unique Mode of Production? So Andy Higginbottom is presenting on Salama and Tran's interpretation of Marx's transformation problem. And he told me about how his department is currently under threat, and which is the politics department at Kingston. So I wanted to ask him to say a few words about that and whether he wanted to share the petition, if you'd like to, Andy, and perhaps you could also introduce yourself as well. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to crash the crash. I can't resist that one. So I'm Associate Professor at Kingston University, London. My area is extractive industries. I'm also interested in international political economy, and in particular, as the paper today will start to approach the question of labour superexploitation. 2 weeks ago, the Dean of our faculty met with staff and with no notice told us that the undergraduate recruitment would be stopped for next academic year on the grounds of not recruiting enough students. And since then, the staff have responded, but in particular, our student body has responded very actively. And I'll just, as Solange mentioned, there's a petition which is initiated by our students. We make the joke that we just set this all up to give the students an exercise in instruction agency, and they've really shown their agency extremely well. But it's a bit more serious than that in actual fact, and it's very likely that jobs will go. The department as a department's under threat. We think that the university's responded very poorly. We obviously are concerned about recruitment and we think we can recruit. It's more a matter of belief and conviction in the type of course we run. Our courses are very human rights centered. They've quite a strong emphasis on transformatory politics. And really, we've been organizationally moved into a business faculty, and we don't fit with the agenda. And the other major point is that most of our students are from working class backgrounds, the majority are Black and ethnic minority. And the faculty is really implementing, it's an outcome of government policy, really, which is being passed down the line, that these type of kids shouldn't be expected to study this type of subject, and they certainly shouldn't have low staff-student ratios. So we're resisting it. And we have a union meeting today. The decision to close undergraduate recruitment, and I'll finish on this, was done without any consultation. There is no legal requirement for consultation, but there is a collective agreement requirement for consultation. So we don't quite know the extent of the cuts because the formal consultation will not start until about a month's time. But in the meantime, the energy of the students has been all important, and I do hope that you will sign the petition and circulate it, and I very much appreciate your support.
Thank you, Andy. So now we'll shift to Niamh's paper. Niamh, yes, if you could give a short summary of the argument of your paper, and then I'll ask you a few questions and we'll move on to Ariane's paper.
Thanks very much, Solange, and I'm sure that the requisite thanks for organizing this conference and this panel in general are sort of even more so in the current context, because I'm sure this can't have been a straightforward thing to put together. So I'll just give a bit of a brief summary of the argument and background of the paper, which effectively comes out of the social study of finance. That's primarily what I do and what I focus on, and in particular, the interaction between what's sort of traditionally understood as low finance, what people do and spend and save in their everyday lives, with high finance, the finance of markets. And this is an area in which a lot of innovative work has been done, in sort of STS or by actor network theorists, because they have been very good at focusing in on the sort of everyday aspects of finance, what finance is doing in the sort of circulation at the level of household saving and spending. But there is typically a sort of rejection of some of the very important advancements that have been made by political economists in this area on the grounds that something like a focus on class would be too deterministic or reductionist. And the upshot of that is that quite often very important discussions about class and inequality sort of get moved to the side as something that we should consider and think about. But the sort of individualized subjects that are thought of in this context tend to be sort of stripped of any particular class markers, with the exception maybe of some acknowledgement that the behavior that they're engaged in financially does more or less represent sort of middle class sensitivities toward finance. And that is a bit reductionist in itself. So I have been very interested on the whole in the way that that class and inequality persists in this domain and is transformed. And in particular, in this paper, I focus, as some of you will have seen, on contingency and unpredictability as something that underpins that. And the paper that I've written for today's panel applies the aleatory approach to historical development that Althusser elaborated in his later work to the social study of finance and the contemporary problem of class and inequality more specifically. So as I get into in the paper, after the 2008 global financial crisis, which resulted in the loss of homes, assets, and savings, as well as jobs and benefits, particularly for the workforce, the question of the sustainability of a way of life predicated on high-risk borrowing came to the fore for policymakers, economists, journalists, and academics alike. Suddenly, notions of uncertainty or contingency, which had grown increasingly prominent as theoretical concepts since the end of the 20th century, were front and center in discussions about the job market, consumption, personal and collective life chances, and national prosperity as a whole, at least in the UK. There was a bit of a new universality about instability and insecurity. We were seeing for the first time in generations how even banks and insurance companies face the possibility of major loss as a result of a bad investment or taking on large-scale risk. This notion of contingency serves, in a way, to undermine earlier ideas of hegemony underpinned by a class-based structure, as increasingly individualized subjects navigate an uncertain terrain in which the unpredictability of personal agency, diversity of experience, and exposure to risk seem to subvert trajectories of linear development and social structure. In this framework, status and material wealth do not completely insulate against loss and disruption of a way of life, a point that has been made more generally by Ulrich Beck, who formulated the idea of the risk society in which unpredictable excess spills over and destabilizes even the middle and upper classes. It has also been made in the context of financial crisis itself, where the idea of parceling out financial risk throughout society spreads it deep into social layers, leading to ramifications even for wealthy investors and large financial institutions. But I'm not sure that any of these conceptions adequately get at the problem of inequality as an entrenched and stratifying process that totally diminishes life chances, and even, bringing us back to the Marxian approach to labor power, subsistence itself. The UK workforce has experienced a particular decline in quality of life, marked by the financial crisis itself, and the subsequent reduction of welfare provision as part of austerity measures meant to claw back government spending and improve its own credit rating. That labor power bore the brunt of the effects of government cuts is inescapably class-based. And so in this paper, I wanted to get back to the idea of contingency and uncertainty, not as a nebulous theoretical stopgap that reminds us of unpredictability, but as a condition of possibility of capital accumulation itself. I return to Althusser's underground materialism of the encounter, which he traces through Marx's reading of primitive accumulation in an attempt to understand the spread of finance and financial logic through otherwise non-financial spheres of society as a new kind of ongoing enclosure. This time, however, it is not of common land, which is part of the means of production directly responsible for producing subsistence, but is instead the enclosure of workers' wages or income, savings or assets, as banks, lenders, and financial institutions increasingly extract profit directly from household finance. Much like the encounter between dispossessed workers and owners of money, the encounter between labor power and financial institutions in the UK was not wholly predictable and not originally geared toward the cultivation of a consumer finance sector itself. But it nonetheless spurred into existence a series of lasting structural effects, resulting in an uneven engagement between labor power and financial institutions. The upshot has been that, although workers are tasked with becoming financially literate in order to develop the entrepreneurial habits that would allow them to take financial risks and earn large rewards, labor power remains a passive participant rather than an active intermediary in financial activity due to structures that favor capital. By this, I mean that workers who are remunerated in wages have no way of shifting or on-selling unwanted risk in the way that banks, financial institutions, and institutional investors can do when they acquire or sell assets or even securitize outstanding financial obligations to move them off their own balance sheets. Workers absorb and do their best to manage risk that comes to them in the form of, for example, pension or mutual fund contributions that fluctuate in value with markets. Their combined actions can certainly destabilize financial markets and institutions themselves, but there is less they can do in terms of active and deliberate engagement. After all, volatile and unpredictable markets also often come with the loss of homes, way of life, or means of subsistence, in comparison with capital itself, which mostly suffers a decline in wealth as a result of the institutionalization of things like limited liability protection, and so they don't face a wholesale crisis of personal and social reproduction. To close then, I'll say that viewing financialization and its crisis in the UK through Althusser's aleatory lens has the benefit of acknowledging the genuine unpredictability that is sought in a non-determinist history. By locating encounters in a truly contingent set of circumstances that are irreducible to developmental trajectories. But as I sought to show in this paper, it also illustrates how contingency can be inscribed within the structure of a social formation in a way that institutionalizes risk and uncertainty against those for whom subsistence and reproduction is always uncertain.
Thank you so much, Niamh, for presenting your paper. I thought it was an excellent paper, and I completely agree with what you observe in a lot of the work that is being done on kind of this question of the financialization of everyday life. And I think that it kind of what seems to happen is that it observes this kind of new phenomenon, or wants to see this kind of new phenomenon, and then sees it as a sort of hegemonous thing that affects everyone. And it really undermines this question of class totally, which I think, I mean, now I'm probably not being very generous, but when you look at Meunier and Koenig's, for example, often it seems almost this dogmatic resistance to Marxism as this highly deterministic theoretical framework, right? And so kind of outrightly dismiss any of that kind of analysis. Yeah. And I think it's very good that you bring that back into the discussion and necessary. So I also think what I thought was really really great actually is that how your paper also is in dialogue with Ariane's paper. And so most of my questions, I'll try to tie them together once Ariane has presented, but still I had two questions for you now, and one of them was whether you'd read The Acid Economy, now recently published by Atkins, Cooper and Koenig's, because I think what they do actually is quite interesting in the sense that they reintroduce the notion of class, but in relation to leverageability, which I think is quite interesting because there they also note, like, listen, you know, risk kind of, you know, an institution taking on risk, or someone, a trader on a trading floor taking risk is not quite the same thing as when people do it. You know, they don't lose their jobs, they don't lose their houses. So I think that was fantastic. So I don't know if you could perhaps comment on that. And there's another question. My second question is about something you say on page 4 of your paper, and you jump from the kind of internal instability of capitalism that generates crisis to the notion of risk itself. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, because it seems to me that the sort of kind of day-to-day uncertainty of household debt is not quite the same as a general economic crisis, or an economic crisis as such. Yeah, maybe I didn't quite understand how you drew that conclusion. So if you could comment on that, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. The asset-based, the work being done in asset-based wealth is obviously very, very interesting because it is a very convincing and well-substantiated argument that you know, obviously the value of assets, especially property, appreciates at a substantially higher rate than what most people are earning in income, and thus as a result that is, for all intents and purposes, where they draw the line about inequality. Because if you're somebody who can afford to buy property or a home without a mortgage, then you have already obviously accrued quite a substantial amount of wealth, and the value of that asset will appreciate so much faster than anything you could put away in savings from wages alone. And they've got a scale sort of for anybody who hasn't read it about, you know, where you fall in terms of being able to purchase with a mortgage and not, you know, all the way down to things like not qualifying for a mortgage at all. And it's very convincing. And I think the only thing that I don't necessarily like is the fact that they want to move so far away from work or the labor force in their discussion of class. And I understand why they do it, because I think that they are genuinely trying to reconceptualize class in the 21st century in the context of finance. And I think the only reason it doesn't work for me is precisely because of this idea of the encounter as Althusser understands it in the context of primitive accumulation. So he's quite adamant that the proletariat is not produced by industry, but is produced by the separation that happens in the encounter between, or the separation that precedes the encounter between the proletariat and the owners of money, as Marx would call it, and that the employment and the creation of an entire capitalist social formation is what reproduces the existence of the proletariat, but that its existence is prior to that. And I think that's sort of how I feel about income-based inequality in the context of finance. It's something that precedes, as a result of the sort of traditional structure of the workforce, and especially in the UK, something like the post-war Fordist kind of accumulation. It's something that absolutely does precede both economically and culturally this encounter with finance itself, but it's inevitable, especially when it comes to things like credit ratings and whether one is classified as high or low risk to borrow, that your income and the kind of work that you do and the sort of more traditional trappings of class will influence your ability to accumulate wealth through assets. So I think I only find it a little heavy-handed in its sort of movement away from the sort of traditional understanding of class, not because I'm insistent that we must sort of adhere to that idea in the way that some of the STS theorists would accuse political economists of doing, but because that has, as Althusser would say, sort of a history in itself that inevitably has effects on what happens after the encounter. So I do find it to be very interesting and very innovative work, and I'll be interested to see whether anybody else makes that combination, or whether in fact I will be able to make that combination. Concerning the second question about risk in the sort of day-to-day life as compared with the sort of crisis of capital accumulation, yes, this is something that probably does not come up as strongly in this paper, because I suppose I thought I needed to get it done and in a reasonable length that did not end up being 10,000 words. But there is very, very interesting work being done, and that has been done by Japanese Marxists on aleatory materialism and Althusser more generally. So I think some like the really well-known stuff is by Kojin Karatani, wrote a book called Tran's Critique, and his work was later taken up by Ken Kawashima, both of whom are interested in the risky leap in Marx, the sort of salto mortal that a seller has to make in hoping that they will find a buyer for what they're looking for. And obviously, I don't know if it probably doesn't come out strongly enough, but it's in the paper that I cite by Kawashima about how what this ultimately means for the working class is that their encounters with capital will be contingent and aleatory, because obviously a relative surplus population means that there are so many people who are looking for jobs, and there are far fewer people who need workers than there are jobs. And he's kind of expanded that in a later paper, which unfortunately I didn't cite in this, but about finance more specifically. So effectively, what comes from that is the sense that the risky leap that is made in the process of circulation, more specifically, which obviously refers more generally to the idea that commodities need a buyer in order to realize value, and a lot is invested into the production process in order to ensure output. But if nobody buys them, then obviously you have quite a significant problem. So it is with labor power as well, in the hope that they will be employed, but the level of risk becomes unevenly weighted in that sense, because we're not just talking about a loss of wealth, but a loss of livelihood and ability to subsist on a daily basis in that sense, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much. No, that does make a lot of sense. And Anna should definitely also read that paper. It's really interesting. Thank you so much for that elaborate response. So I think we can move now to Ariane's paper, so that we can keep that discussion going. I think they really talk to each other, these two papers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was really thrilled to see this call for papers, because it kind of like motivated me to take up this question, which I had since I wrote my dissertation. So I wrote my dissertation, finished in 2013, and it was about medical uncertainty. And I had this chapter, which was definitely the weakest link in my dissertation, which concerned the relationship between, medical knowledge or medical technologies and capital, or capitalism more broadly. And so a few years following that, I had read a bunch of books, and I was like, I think I know how to solve this problem, but I'd never put pen to paper, as it were. So I'm so grateful to be a part of this conference, and that you actually, stirred that fire, or lit that fire, whatever the correct idiom is here. So thank you so much to you, Solange, and the organizers for this opportunity. So basically, the paper engages with the bioeconomy, which is, broadly considered the techno-scientific process of exchanging tissues and related materials for profit. So like very broadly, a number of, the literature really kind of took off in 2006, when the OECD said like, hey, by 2030, we're gonna be living in this like new bioeconomy world, and we need to prepare for it in terms of how these exchanges will happen. And so a lot of the questions that started to happen in the social science literature concerned like whether the bioeconomy was in fact something that was unique, or was this like kind of just another, is this just like more of the same? And there was a bit of a debate around whether it was in fact Marxian in terms of its commitments, or whether it's organized in similar ways as Marx put forward, or whether it was actually something entirely unique. And so in the potentially like untoward spirit of having a question as the title of your paper and then answering it with no. That's essentially what I wanted to do in this paper, because and so I think I'll just kind of summarize some of the main points, because I'm really, because this is nascent, like this has been an idea that's been kind of like rummaging around in the back of the drawer, so to speak, and this is the first attempt that I've tried to make to really make this case. I'll just kind of summarize some of the aspects of it. So in my view, the ideas around the bioeconomy tend to focus on two main changes in the contemporary moment. The first being biocapital, or what exactly is the thing that's accumulated and then exchanged for profit. So the idea that surrogacy, or the use of one's body to test a new therapy or new drug, harvesting, growing, culturing of oocytes, gametes, and these kinds of things. So in saying, hey, there's this new stuff which is commodifiable, that's one justification for how this represents a shift in our capitalist mode of production. The other is the nature of the laborer. And this, I think, comes out especially in the work of Walbean Mitchell, as well as Cooper and Mitchell, anyway, there's a number of different kind of attempts to demonstrate the way that the laborer, or the person who puts something to work, right, their own body, their own tissues in a way, and that happens within usually a condition of precarity, as a great deal of this type of labor actually happens in India and China, where there's no access to other types of healthcare. So this becomes kind of like an exchange for the laborer, like, hey, you can get some healthcare, but you have to test this new drug. And of course, that then of course demonstrates a kind of changing nature of the work that the laborer is doing. And so it's on these 2 points that there tends to be this justification that there is in fact something unique that has happened with the emergence of this bioeconomy. What I do in the paper is I take the work they've already done and I rerun it through Althusser's coordination, because I think that what's happened is they've looked at the change in potentially the content of capital, or the content of the labor, rather than focusing on the relations that organize it. So I put it back into the relations, or what Althusser calls like the property connection, or the real or material appropriation connection between the labor, the non-labor, and of course, the circulation of certain types of forces of production. So that's what I run through to say, hey, look, we can still do this. And then the paper as it is concludes with me trying to be like, but why? Like, what exactly has happened here? Why is it that we do have, bio business as usual? We still have these relations that are organizing the elements within this setup of exchange. And I think that what's happened is a meta-theoretical oversight insofar as focusing on the laborer, is that they've re-envisioned what the place is of capitalism in terms of the overall kind of theoretical structure. So that's kind of, it's provisional in that I want to say there's been some kind of a misappropriation, no pun intended, of the commitments about what the object of analysis is in order to declare a new mode of production. It's not necessarily just a shift in content of capital or the laborer and how they appropriate the means of production to put their bodies to work in different ways, or their tissues, or their time, etc. And so I think that's kind of the big picture, is that we see this kind of like focus on who or what, rather than what are the relations that coordinate all of these things. And that is why there's been this announcement of a new beginning, whereas I don't necessarily think that is the case. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariane. Yeah, that was, I think, and that is exactly where kind of Niamh's and your paper coincide, because you both kind of use the same move. You're saying, okay, well, there's people thinking about these phenomena now that are seemingly so unique, or that are characterized as being unique, but what you are both doing is you're going back to evaluating kind of these inherent mechanisms of capitalism through a reading of Althusser, and you add Balibar to that as well, Althusser and Balibar, and saying, well, actually, maybe this is something that is endemic rather to capitalism itself, rather than introducing this new paradigm almost, which maybe also is kind of the product of an academic tendency or institutionalization of we always have to be kind of coming up with these new ideas. So I felt that was very fruitful, and especially how it tries to reintroduce this notion of structures, the systemic. So what I was wondering how we could kind of connect these two things, because what seemed to be very, very fruitful to me was this idea of the enclosure of everyday life that Niamh mentions, and you what seems to be happening in your paper. Maybe I am now extrapolating from this. I don't know, but how there is also this idea of reproduction and reproduction of life itself, and ultimately, aren't we then coming back to kind of this vampire sort of idea that ultimately by the end of the day you kind of need this reproductive element of actual people in kind of the flesh and the blood, and also the relation, maybe is there a relation to be drawn between this idea of the biobanks, the bank and the biobank, and I'm not entirely sure how the biobank works, because at one more point you mentioned venture capital, and then I'm like, well, when I read this from sort of a finance perspective, it just really sounds like the packaging of a financial product. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain how the biobank works, and perhaps think also, Andy, if you sort of want to drop in and think about how these relations work and what the biobank might mean, that'd be excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I hadn't even thought of that. That's wonderful. I'm really looking forward to hearing about whether Niamh sees any overlaps as well. Probably, and maybe I'll set this up, Niamh, that in terms of how I see some of these aspects, and certainly this draws on Cooper and Mitchell as well being Cooper. So the biobank can store umbilical cord blood, stem cells, and basically there's kind of like two different ways that this can happen. One is like through a kind of public biobank, which is premised, according to Cooper and Mitchell, on a kind of gift economy or a gift exchange, right? Like you're donating your umbilical cord blood as a new parent. You're going to donate your new child's umbilical cord blood to this biobank that's public, and you no longer have, it's no longer your asset, so to speak. It's kind of like, it's a gift to society, because whatever science, the biotechnologies, whatever they're able to extrapolate will eventually potentially benefit society as a whole, either through new therapies or insights or techniques, and so on. The other side of things is how is more kind of like assets related. Like it's like you're investing in your future, and they link it, of course, to a kind of neoliberalism that's a part of what a biobank is. So this is kind of like the new parent is approached and says, like what you could donate from this umbilical cord blood or stem cells could potentially benefit you in future. If you have a kind of heritable cancer, you could potentially use those stem cells from your own child. Your child can use them in future. And it's kind of like you rent a space where it's kind of like your own, bio, security box. And the idea is that you maintain property in a sense over what the material actually is. But of course, if you ever need to access it, then you'd have to pay for whatever you're going to do with those stem cells or umbilical cord blood. And they mention a lot of different, they focus primarily on leukemia, especially like childhood leukemia, and how umbilical cord blood is an easier match, instead of bone marrow transplants, which are quite ambiguous. But anyway, it's kind of pitched as this like, a kind of private future asset, and you pay rent to hold these, cells or this blood, in, some cryo chambers somewhere, with the promise of potentially, securing yourself against an unknown aleatory future. This is where I'm just like trying to gesture towards Niamh's paper here. But before I do let that kind of, sit, I do want to just also mention that, part of this, big picture, and in the connections between, Niamh's view and my own as well. And I'm just going to plug that we have a new special issue coming out in the next about 6 weeks, which will be available online in Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior. And actually, Niamh contributed a paper which actually spells out this in the STS literature, specifically how certain types of nominalist commitments have rendered, and of course she's focused on financialization, but I think this is quite fruitful for thinking about how nominalism tends to focus on the individual rather than the relations that organize those individual activities. So I think Niamh already has the answer for me, a forthcoming answer for how I'm going to try to tackle that last aspect of my paper. Anyway, I wanted to make sure that I plugged that, and over to you, Niamh.
I think the thing that stands out so much to me, because the point that I just keep making over and over again in all of my criticisms against the sort of STS approach, or the A&T approach more specifically, yes, obviously no concept of social relations, very flat ontology as a result. But the question of the reproduction, I mean, they would have no concept of the reproduction of the social formation, because the social formation does not exist so much as, sort of reliance on something resembling more of Foucault's play of forces in a strategic field of power relations. And so I am very insistent on thinking about over-determination by class in the work that I do, especially where something like subjectivity is concerned, because that is what gives insight into the means that people have at hand, and as a result, the strategies that they will engage in to be able to reproduce themselves socially. And your paper almost talks about like the very literal, I mean, not the sort of basic sense of human reproduction that we're accustomed to, but like the literal fibers of reproduction and the necessity behind that. And well, I suppose the commodification of it, and indeed, yes, the sort of use as an insurance policy against a sort of unknown risk. So I'm quite struck by that, and very struck as well by the literal nature of it, especially since obviously ordo-liberalism and neoliberalism are really taken with the idea of human capital. And that's, that's kind of the logical conclusion of it, really. It's you have taken, in addition to all of your personal qualifications and training and your experience, and anything else that you can use to sort of leverage yourself in a sort of risky situation to make sure that you come out of it or succeed, you can also bank this in a genetic sense, or with the actual material of yourself. I don't know that necessarily fills the gaps for you. But I mean, for me, it just always comes back, I think, to reproduction and the conditions of possibility of something. And in a way, with your paper and the analysis of something like a biobank, we're talking sort of in the most obvious sense, in a way that doesn't necessarily, I don't know if that's immediately obvious, but now that I'm thinking of it, it just seems like the most obvious sense of something like reproduction of, in some cases, labor power or.
Yeah, thank you so much, Niamh. Andy, would you like to respond, or would you like to move to your paper so that we can integrate that into the discussion? We have to be a bit mindful of time, but we can also go a bit over time if there's more questions from the audience. But I'll check in with you how you feel and see how that goes.
I think there is a potential connection, especially in relation to human capital idea, but I think probably it's best if I present my paper and then we just see how convergent or not our different starting points are. Is that okay?
Yes, excellent. Please do.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen, and I do apologize for not having circulated this in advance as a paper. It will become a paper very shortly, I hope. It's I'm going to look at the novelty and significance of two French authors, Salama, Pierre Salama, and Tran, and their interpretation of Marx's transformation problem. The aim really of this particular paper is to fit in with a larger project, and that larger project is to connect two debates. The first debate is quite well known, well rehearsed, first arose in the French literature in the 1970s, and it's the so-called unequal exchange debate. And one view is that commodities from the global south, as we call it today, sell at lower prices than their due value, and that commodities in the richer part of the world, the imperialist countries or the global north, sell at prices at higher than their true value. And the explanation for this is polarized between Emmanuel, who basically says, well, wages are lower in the south and wages are higher in the north, so there's a direct extrapolation of cost. And that's repudiated by his former PhD supervisor, Bettelheim, who says, actually, you've got that wrong. It's due to the variation of the composition of capital in different sectors. In other words, the sectors that have higher prices are concentrated in capital intensive sectors rather than labor intensive sectors. I think that this debate is well known in the English speaking world as well, and there's definitely a convergence with similar debates which have taken place in Latin America. I don't think the debate's ever been quite resolved because what you've got is two sort of unsatisfactory halves of a whole. And the basic overall thesis is that the concept of labor superexploitation allows one to resolve this debate. The second debate is more technical. It's a bit like, I don't know, how can I say this? It's a bit of a challenge of those who like to indulge in a lot of mathematical fisticuffs, really, is the reputation the transformation the problem has now acquired. The way it's posed in Capital Volume 3 is there's a transformation of commodities that are not actually sold at their simple values, but at their prices of production. In other words, not C plus V plus S, as Marx became accustomed to presenting value in volumes 1 and 2, but in cost, which is C plus V plus profit. So the transformation is both of value to price of production, but more specifically of surplus value to profit. Now, the state of the debate in the literature is between two schools. They identify slightly differently, but the one school, synchronic school, was sort of co-founded really by two authors, Dumenil in France and Foley in the United States, and there's another school. Now, my position is, if you like, an outlier position. And what my position is that the prevailing Marxian literature interpretation of the transformation problem misreads what's really at stake. In a sense, it minimizes what's at stake. The prevailing interpretation sees the transformation as essentially between commodity inputs and outputs. And on that basis, the consensus in the literature is that Marx made a mistake and that he recognized that mistake himself, but his inputs were at simple values, whereas his outputs were at prices of production. And therefore, logically, one has to transform the inputs into prices of production in order to have a systemic consistency. Now, how to solve that problem is the focus of the synchronic diachronic debate. One view says you solve it within one period, and one view says you solve it over a series of periods in an iterative fashion. And that's more or less the state of the debate. My dissatisfaction with this debate led to a sort of search in the literature. I found nothing, to be honest, basically in the English language literature, which coincided with the point of view I was developing, until I read the work of Pierre Salama, who published mostly in French. He has one article, one book chapter in English, and he argues on certain points against Marx's statement in the text of Capital itself. He argues that the essence of the transformation is not from inputs to outputs, but a different modality, which is from inner to outer. And in this interpretation of the transformation, he definitely builds on the work by Duménil. Duménil draws a distinction, which is, if you like, textual linguistic, but it's important conceptually as well, but in the translation of form. What is a form? And what he points out is that there's a difference between form as an outer phenomena and form as an internal configuration. And this is actually a really important distinction, as I hope we'll come on to. And the other distinction that Salama emphasizes is between value and exchange value. And what this does is it's contradicting the prevailing critique, which is on a neo-Ricardian basis, of Marx's solution. Because what the distinction between value and exchange value draws out, it comes to a head when you look at the question of measure. How do you measure value? And if you're looking at the internal measure, you're talking about hours of labor time. But if you're talking about the external measure, you're talking about money. And the neo-Ricardian solution to the transformation problem avoids effectively the question of the reality of money and invents another way of externally representing value. And so what you have is, in Salama, a defense of the importance of Marx's theory of money, as well as his theory of the transformation. What Salama does is he logically positions prices of production as being similar to what Marx does in Volume 1, Chapter 1, the very difficult and much discussed first chapter of Capital. And what he says is that the logical transition, which Marx repeats in the transformation problem in Volume 3, is an application of the law of value at the level of many capitals. Okay, I want to come back to that point as well. So, as well as critiquing the existing literature, Salama's solution is goes against most of the explanations in the mainstream, certainly mid-20th century literature, which saw that the prices of production were formed by a process of capital transferring from less profitable sectors to more profitable sectors. And what Salama points out is that logically prices of production have to be formed before this transfer because they're the basis of a profit. And so he argues that there must be some internal regulator, application within each sector of the law of value in such a way that the producers have to follow prices of production as the regulator. He uses the term sanction for this, okay. So now we come to a point at which I depart from Salama. I think he made a real breakthrough, but I think that his application of the concept of many capitals to prices of production then takes a wrong turn, basically. And so he sees prices of production as the equivalent of values, and he sees market prices as the equivalent of exchange values. And I think that that parallel is a mistaken one. It's a mistaken mapping between the categories of Volume 1, Chapter 1 and the categories of Volume 3. But I think his idea of sanction should be maintained. It's a really important concept. It's based on how each sector, each capital in each sector works out its prices of production. And the rate of profit is an essential component of that calculation, which is, if you like, crystallized at the level of each individual capital operating. So the conversion of value to exchange value is not static, but changes as the social conditions of production change within each sector. And now what follows is I'm going to sort of slightly go over this terrain again in a bit more detail, but effectively trying to fill out the argument. And the way I'm going to do that is just by following the argument as it developed from Salama to his student, Tran, who has written a 2-volume study in French, not available in English. And he posits 3 main arguments about Das Kapital. The first is, and the one I'm going to concentrate on, or the first 2, is the concept of exchange value requires a double definition. He's not the only one to argue this, but I think his argument is particularly clear. And then he applies this, as did Salama, to the transformation problem. And for reasons of scope and time, I'll leave the rest out. But the overall project, which Tran argues and makes more explicit in her later work, is that the law of value and the social relations of the capitalist mode of production cannot be fully defined in their generality without bringing the state into that definition. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is just quickly rehearse Tran's interpretation of this challenging Volume 1, Chapter 1. And his main point is that the first 2 sections of Chapter 1 are focused on the commensurability of value. In other words, when Marx says 1/4 of corn equals 1 x hundredweight of iron, the equals there stands for means the same amount of, and that the of is socially necessary labor time. So we have a quantitative relation which concerns the content or the substance of value. And this is sort of normally assumed to be the labor theory of value. Okay, how do you compare commodities, how much socially necessary labor time is in them, and we can bring them into comparison. They're commensurate because they all contain socially necessary abstract labor. Okay, and this is developed by Marx in section 2 of Chapter 1, where he distinguishes between the concrete labor of any particular use value and the abstract social labor of exchange value in general. So the contradiction of the commodity is between use value and exchange value. That's the driving contradiction. Now, what Tran points out is that very quickly Marx actually revisits his own determination of exchange value. And this is the theoretical departure, as well as abstract and concrete labor, beyond the classical political economy before Marx. And this expression, which people who know this field might get a little bit tired of, the infamous or notorious 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. Okay, now what's really going on here? I think Marx says this, but if he was being marked by a lecturer like me, he could have been invited to do more signposting of his argument. Okay, so what he's doing here is signposted by Tran quite effectively in his commentary. And it really emphasizes that what the equals sign says here is something completely different to what we normally understand as equals, right? What it's expressing is expression. Okay, so 20 yards of linen is expressed, its value is expressed as one coat. It is worth one coat. So the relationship is fundamentally qualitative, and it's talking about the exchangeability of commodities. So this concentration on value form, which other writers have certainly, the value form school have emphasized this, right? Tran also is working in this area, but he, to me, brings out the point with greater clarity, which is the point is not that commodities are just commensurate, but how actually do they exchange? And they have to exchange as money measured entities. Okay, so the definition of the commodity is co-determinous with the ontological status of money. You cannot have the one without the other. So what Tran distinguishes here is value is expressed and measured not in labor, but in money. And as I say, there are similar arguments presented by the value form school, okay? He goes on, we don't have much time to detail this, but one of his, I think, generally original contributions is he actually understands better than certainly me and most people about money. And Marx writes in this part of volume 1 about different functions of money. And Tran begins to unpack this and explain what Marx is doing here. And he brings a state in. Okay, so gold is a commodity which is selected as a money commodity, but how does it actually become money? And the state comes into this relationship. Now, some reflections on Tran's contribution is he is consciously avoiding both a nominalist and a metalist theory of money. Slightly more generally, he's consciously avoiding both the embodied labor and the value form schools, although he does have a lot of overlap with the value form school. The real point I want to concentrate on going forward is this question of a double movement, a double statement of what exchange value is actually also a double statement of what the commodity is. And so in his first statement, he's looking at the commodity in general. And in the second statement of exchange value, he's looking at a system of particular commodities in a system which comes together with money. Okay, so this is the exchangeability. The form is a community of exchanging commodities, but they don't exchange. There's no barter. It's by definition through money. Okay. Tran himself is quite critical of, suspicious is the term I've got here, of Hegel and his influence on Marx, especially the science of logic. He's suspicious of the idea of an unfolding revelation, which is the movement of science of logic. But I think actually there is a greater influence on Marx from Hegel than Tran takes into account. Not only because of Marx's own comments about the coquetting he writes in a letter, but slightly stepping back a little bit, I think Marx pretty much underdeclares how much he's actually reworked from Hegel, particularly the significance of measure, which is a key transition from being to essence in the science of logic. How something, an outline, how do we get to moving from the outline being to what it actually really is? Measures a key sort of moment in that transition. And also particularly useful in this is the Vazjulin's commentary on Marx's Capital from the perspective of how it works with Hegel's science of logic. And what you get from Vazjulin is this idea of an initial movement from appearance to essence in volume 1, from commodity to surplus value, if you like. It's a general movement, but of course, even within chapter 1 of volume 1, you have commodity to socially necessary labor. Time is the essence of value, right? But the movement doesn't stop there. It's how then does this essence become actually on the surface again? How does it reappear and reshape what the surface reality is? And this is the notion of an actualized appearance. And this movement, Marx actually, when you look for it, you can see Marx does this time and time and time again within the structure of Das Kapital. And so the not only within the rotation of a simple commodity economy of chapter 1, but in the work as a whole, volume 3 of Capital is really all about the actualization of essence, the actual appearance of the essence, surplus value as profit, as rent, as interest, and so on. Tran on the transformation follows similar lines to Salama. He draws a strong homology of form. In other words, he says what Marx does in volume 1, chapter 1, moving from the commodity in general to the commodity as plurality, Marx repeats again in volume 3, where he moves from capital in general to capital as a plurality, as a system of competing capitals. And he's right about that, but my positioning is he doesn't go far enough. He doesn't actually carry this argument on the logical form into recognizing why that's necessary in terms of a reworking of the content. Okay, so in volume 3, and I'm getting close to the end of my presentation, in volume 3, the crucial contradiction that starts the movement in part 1 of volume 3 is not the contradiction between use value and exchange value. It's of the commodity as a capitalist commodity. That is to say, as the product of labor versus, in a different sense, the product of capital. So Marx is bringing into explicit consideration what was only implicit at the beginning of the book, which is the commodity is now explicitly a capitalist commodity. Okay, so this is the actualization of the essence, which combines both circulation and production. So now where does that leave us with how far we take the homology, the repeating pattern? So what I think is, and Marx doesn't start, Marx starts this process, but he doesn't complete it. And that's why there's so many debates and different interpretations. It's an unfinished argument, right? But what I think needs to happen is that the substance of value needs to be traced through to its actual expression as prices of production. So in one system, we need to include socially necessary labor time and prices of production, and how to see how one is considered as a capitalist commodity. It's not a direct equivalence. It's not like a single gearing. It's a multiple gearing. And the gearing or the variation is by the composition of capital in the sectors. So the weight of capital in each sector distorts the simple expression of value as the result of labor time only. The conversion of value, socially necessary labor time, to exchange value is not static, but changes as the social conditions of production within the sector change. This is the last slide, apart from the references. So I have two further thoughts, and this is to connect now with the sort of larger, broader argument. What I'm arguing that both Salama and Tran did make an important breakthrough. They recognize this point about inner to outer, but what does inner to outer actually mean? Are we just talking about different layers of exchange value or different modifications to exchange value? Or are we talking about a different way in which value is expressed as exchange value? In other words, a repositioning of the relationship between the substance of value as well as its form. We need to reconsider the transformation problem in volume 3 in respect, and this is the second major point. In the premise of setting up the problem of the transformation in volume 3, Marx actually identifies, with Engels' help, 3 variables. Most discussion of Marx's solution concentrates only on one, which is the variation of organic composition. But if you look at Marx's setting up of the problem in part 1 of volume 3, he actually considers 3 variables. One is the organic composition, but the other one is the rate of turnover of capital. And the third one is different rates of surplus value, different degrees of exploitation according to different social conditions. men and women, black and white, region, colonized and colonizer, okay, by country, region. He deals with this in a very cursory and simple way. And in part 2, it's dropped as one of the variables in the problem. So what Marx has done is it's a bit like simple reproduction. He's restricted the parameters in order to establish the general pattern, okay? But in actual fact, what he's done is just like a first cut to the solution rather than the full solution, even on the premise of his own posing of the problem. That's part of the incompleteness of his solution. Okay, so so that's a step on the way, which we'll have to leave it for now. But what I'm trying to do here is to establish, you know, on the premise of the conference, how I think quite a real breakthrough in the French literature has been barely recognized in the, if you like, the Anglophone world in relation to this. And it's something I want to recover and build on.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's material that I'm a lot more unfamiliar with, but one of the things that I really liked, I found really interesting, is this notion of the form and kind of the transformability of commodities themselves, and have kind of a more pluralistic or complex understanding of this transformation problem, if I understood correctly, that both combines labor processes and circulation as well. So because we're running a bit short of time, I will ask when we're 30 minutes over, if people would be okay to go a bit over time. I do have 2 questions, but I wanted to ask you, Andy, first, if you wanted to comment on a general discussion, and then we'll move to the question.
I'm slightly out of fashion. I think primitive accumulation is overdone. I think that the recourse to primitive accumulation to explain doubt, for example, and contingency, I mean, it's okay, but it's actually not the full McCoy, right? Well, so, for example, if you take uncertainty with relation to debt, I think that Marx's contribution is much fuller in volume 3 of Capital. It's just that it's not well known. I mean, we are actually trying to recover a cultural level where we understand how all 3 volumes of Capital work. And in the 3rd volume of Capital, Marx writes a lot about the credit system. And he talks about the credit system as a combination of prophets and swindlers. So what you have is this inherent contingency in the movement of the advanced capitalist of his time credit system. And that's not really primitive accumulation, you know what I mean? It's the diabolically contingent nature of how capitalist crises, I mean, the imminent tendency becomes a reality. And so, yeah, I'm on a slight mission. I think everybody needs to get back to a level to have a proper debate where we actually understand how the 3 volumes of Capital work. And I actually do think that, to be really frank, Althusser is a bit cookie cutter in this, right? He doesn't actually work through the 3 volumes and understand how they work together. So there's snatches of insight, but they're not yet back at the level that Marx left them.
Shall I respond to that, or would you like to move to?
I don't want to make the whole discussion about Althusser. I'm sorry, but I was asked to respond. So.
I do have, yeah, I do feel a bit. I do have some questions from the audience, so maybe we should move to that, and we can continue this discussion among ourselves if we wish to. Right. So the first question from Lois, if I pronounce that correctly. Sorry if I do not. From the chat. This is a question for Niamh, who might have read the question already, but it reads: do you see the current development of sustainable finance as a new form to reproduce inequality, both at social level and globally, in the example of using carbon certificates? Very specific.
I think that this question sort of points to some of the work that is being done by political economists who, for better or worse, are inspired by Althusser in their understanding of the development of capitalism. Some of you may be familiar with the regulation school and their interest in understanding why, in spite of multiple crises, the capitalist mode of production is ultimately able to rescue itself in some fashion and reproduce itself in a new way. And one of the answers that they come up with to that are modes of social regulation, which include sort of regulation in the sort of narrow economic sense that we think of it when we consider how governments implement measures to control what happens, or at least regulate what happens in markets. But it also includes the infrastructure and apparatuses that sort of, in terms of social relations, make reproduction at the economic level possible. And so something like sustainable finance sort of, I think, comes up in this way in response to the obvious environmental crisis that has to be confronted in some way, even if there's obviously in some cases a very vocal either government or oppositional response to it. It is something that investors and businesses are actively taking account of. And so as a result, whether it contributes directly to what I've called the sort of institutionalization of inequality on the everyday level, I think is not necessarily direct, since it's the kind of thing that aims to ameliorate environmental problems through financial mechanisms. I think I work with a lot of people in my substantive work who are, previously engaged with things like corporate finance, and their comment on financial markets is that despite the sort of rhetoric of innovation and risk-taking and entrepreneurialism that is associated with them, they will not innovate without incentive. And so something like sustainable finance serves to sort of innovate in the direction of environmental responsibility that's kind of needed to address a crisis that may be fomenting on some level in order to try and reproduce a kind of precarious social formation in that respect. And so whether that then trickles down to household finance by making various things either more accessible or perhaps more expensive, there will certainly be some ramifications for household finance there.
Thank you so much, Niamh. So Pierre had his hand up next. Pierre, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. I have a question for Ariane and one for Niamh. For Ariane, I think that it's absolutely convincing what she exposed, that there are more continuities than discontinuities in bioeconomy compared to the other kinds of economy, let's say. The question is, how could bioeconomy be organized and managed in a post-capitalist society? Because I think that a leading role of the state would be rather dangerous in this field. Let's imagine the Chinese government having this role. For Niamh, do you think that a measure like the universal unconditional basic income would be good to mitigate the aleatory risky condition of citizens? Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. I really appreciate your feedback. And your question is like, yeah, I have not thought about this, and it scares me too. So now that you've posed it, yeah, I mean, like my like inner socialist leanings are, I don't know, I'm thinking of like cheeky, like each stem cell according to their need or something, you know, like some sort of you know, forward society kind of thinking about you know, only drawing on some sort of collective resource should one find it absolutely necessary. Yeah, I feel like in terms, I feel like probably Niamh has the better insights here on the way that regulatory impositions play a role or don't in terms of how these kinds of markets, whether they're bioeconomic markets or otherwise, you know, may have some kind of, you know, ramification at the level of class or the organization of society more generally. So I'm really not sure. I do like the idea of like a commune bank, like a communal biobank, right? And thinking about a kind of like socially, you know, if I'm thinking utopian, I'm thinking of like a, you know, a socially kind of beneficial biobank where, you know, all genetic material is accessible for, you know, whatsoever purpose, not just for commercialization or private profit or private gain. You know, so certainly those are my like deep kind of like socialist commitments in terms of how might this be managed in a post-capitalist society. But in terms of how to get there, I think that things are so far, you know, like ever since the Reagan administration, like allowing to commercialize on these types of technological procedures and the modification and innovation on life. I think that this is, I think we're a long way away from any kind of, you know, post-capitalist bio world, sadly. But yeah, thank you so much for that emancipatory, you know, invitation. I appreciate that.
And yes, as far as something like universal basic income, I think it comes up and is advocated so strongly because it is something that would fundamentally reduce risk first and foremost. I think a lot of people can think back to, particularly in the UK, the idea of the sort of post-war social contract in which something like welfare was considered as necessary to provide people with a kind of basic standard of living that would allow them to engage economically and politically and socially. And so the idea of something like universal basic income is kind of, you know, I mean, when we think there's sort of a double problem between poverty in absolute terms and then the risk of people becoming impoverished just because of the financial uncertainty that's introduced into their lives. So something like this, I think, really takes seriously, sort of in another way, like a mode of social regulation that thinks about how people's lives could be much smoother as a result and not require them to have to think about, you know, the most basic things like whether they will have a job that pays sufficient income or wages for them to get by with. Yes.
Thank you so much.
The next question is from the chat. Very interesting question. For Niamh, does your model reinserting class reinforce or address intersectional outcomes to inequality?
Yes, that's obviously a very important question. So thank you for bringing it up. I think the thing that, you know, whether it comes out strongly enough in this paper, probably not. When I think about class, it is in its ontological conditions about you know, the ability to reproduce individuals and how the ability of labor power to reproduce itself effectively and what means they have at their disposal to do that. Obviously, sometimes in other debates that will become, for some people, quite an identity-focused sort of thing, especially in the UK, where there is a strong history of working class movements and identity with class. So in my case, I certainly think what it basically talks about is kind of the bare minimum that people have in order to be able to reproduce themselves, leaving room open for the fact that obviously there will be specific kinds of engagement with finance that may be further complicated for there are so many variables that go into risk models about who is likely to be classified as low and high risk. And that does have to do with things like age and things like asset ownership, but inevitably gender and ethnicity plays a greater part in it in the UK than I think people would like to acknowledge. And certainly in somewhere like the US, it absolutely, entire neighborhoods will be redlined as a result of where somebody lives being either predominantly white or black or something like that. So I would hope and anticipate that a model like this would absolutely be inclusive of the possibility of doing intersectional work to think about how additional components like that would interact basically over this basic question of how are people able to reproduce themselves effectively.
Thank you, Niamh. I have a last, if you all agree to take a last question that we still have from the chat. I also have a question for Andy, but I will send that via email if we go too much over time. Is everyone fine with the last question from the chat? Okay, Tim, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. It's both to Andy and to Ariane. Andy, you started off with the Bettelheim Emmanuel debate, and I can obviously see the implications of this reading of the transformation problem, and you kind of circle back to it at the end. But I wonder if you could just briefly say a bit more about how this might give us, like you mentioned that both Bettelheim and Emmanuel kind of give the partial picture. I was wondering how this gives us a fuller idea of unequal exchange or exploitation across, the metropole and the periphery, or whatever the case may be. And then, Ariane, it's linked to this idea of the unequal exchange. You also started off by saying that a lot of these the kind of pharmaceutical trials happen in India and China. So I wonder the unit of a mode of production. So obviously this is some kind of distinct, this appears to people as a distinct form of economy, the bioeconomy, something distinct from traditional capitalism maybe. And so the mode of production could be the unit of analysis. But I'm wondering the fact that a lot of the kind of trials and the production, the kind of surplus is extracted from the global south, maybe the unequal exchange as opposed to the individual mode of production is the more important unit of analysis. And I wonder what you thought about that.
So I'll come in. Thank you for the question, Tim. Yeah, I mean, basically, Marx did lay the basis for a solution. He by restricting his premises, he didn't reach that point of unfolding it. So as soon as you take into account the possibility of different rates of surplus value, which aren't based on technological factors, but are due to different social factors, more authoritarian states, oppression of racial groups or by gender, then what you're talking about is people getting less money for producing the same value. So we just heard in the news today about the shop workers in Asda. I think the women getting paid substantially less than the men in the distribution centres, right? So that's not due to anything else apart from it's an index of social oppression. It's using gender to oppress workers more. And so the concept of superexploitation does not accept the equality of labour powers, that capitalism has an inherent tendency, not just not just at level of social formation, but in the mode of production itself, it has an inherent tendency to disequalize labor power in terms of the reward that labor power gets, because it's an inherent drive to increase surplus value. I mean, in a sense, it's so common sense and obvious in one sense, but it's actually rejected by Marxists, which is the drive for cheap labor will increase surplus value. And so that needs to be brought into Marx's theoretical framework, because, I mean, inconveniently for my position, Marx argues at several points that it should not be included in this framework because he works on the assumption of the equality of labor power. But I think what's happening there is he's critiquing liberal political economy on its own foundation, on its own presumption. But capitalism itself goes beyond the presumption of equality. Okay, so what you have is a relational inequality of labor powers. And this comes to the point of intersectionality and identity, right? So intersectionality relates to the production of surplus value. Some workers are more oppressed and more exploited than others. And under the same technical conditions, they're going to produce higher profits. So that's how it comes in. I'm really sorry, I do have to go. I'm being called because we have a union meeting, but I really appreciate the invitation. And I'm sorry to be harsh on Althusser, but it's more, I would rather put it the other way around. We need to build on the other French Marxists, okay?
All right, thanks,
Thank you
Andy.
so much, Andy.
Thank you.
Thank you, I'll send you my question, bye.
Yeah, thank you. I want to also encourage people that if it aligns with your political, commitments, to definitely sign that petition and circulate it if you feel so motivated. But yeah, just to kind of respond to your question, thank you for thinking, for raising this issue about the nature, like, it's definitely, I think, a valuable, in terms of like raising awareness and, like I 100% on board with your point about like, but maybe we do need to make front and center the nature of this kind of transnational exploitation of different peoples in different places, especially the global South, which you're absolutely right. I guess and I'm just just in terms of my own commitments, like as I think that even raised by Raja and others who have done this work, like in the book Biocapital, there are still like the conditions under which this kind of exchange becomes possible, whether they are from legal and political changes that happened, which made it more desirable to move into India and China, whether we're looking at just the fact that certain kinds of innovations can be commodified and exchanged, and innovated upon, commercialized, etc. So I do, I think that like if I'm going to be putting on my kind of critical theory hat, it's that like the nature of the exploitation is like stop one, right? You're like, okay, this is happening, but then to kind of open it up to explain, what are the relations that make this exploitation possible, right? It's an object that needs an explanation, or it's a situation that needs that kind of historical and social analysis. And similarly, right? Like if we're thinking about exploitation as being related to a broader kind of value judgment around the fact that we don't want this, right? As a society, we don't value this this kind of relation of exploitation, that we're benefiting from the labor that's happening across the globe. Is that even if we're thinking like in the spirit of like Axel Honneth, it's like we have to then also be accountable historically to why that is the value that that organizes this investigation, right? So it's kind of putting back in some of the historical bigger picture. So yes, I 100% agree with what you're saying, but also like kind of like as a starting point, right, for explanatory and also normative reflection more generally. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We do have a last question for Robin, if time permits. I think we should max aim for 40 past, if that's okay. If it's a very short question, Robin, please, if you can pop it into the chat now, or if you want to ask it in person, also fine.
I would, but Pierre had his hand up first.
I think Pierre has had his hand up since the first question. I think he didn't lower it.
My question is really quick, and it's about the relations that weren't mentioned, and that is the bigger segments of biocapital, which are organs. And in the light of Nancy Shepherd-Hughes, the blood and organ business is an illegal business that has been around for much longer than this legal business of biocapital. Yet some of the framings about the relations in biocapital are found in this illegal or quasi-legal state if we look at the current organ extraction happening in China with the Uyghur camps. So these forms of legal or illegal relations or quasi-legal relations inform this. And I'm wondering if your paper addresses that.
No, that's absolutely an omission on my part. Yeah, I think that that's a really important, thing to think about, especially in terms of kind of like the broader kind of historical, the big picture, so to speak. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing my attention back to that Shepherd-Hughes argument. I think that's absolutely great. I think if I was going to do that kind of, historical analysis, I think I would definitely need to bring that in. I think that's a great point. As the paper stands now, it's more just like rerunning the data kind of, as it is. But I think that that's something that I should probably work up in the paper as well. Like this other aspect of the, I'll be Foucauldian, the tolerated illegalities, right, around organ exchange. Yeah, thank you, Robin. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the presenters, and thank you for all the wonderful questions and for attending this session. The next panel is at 2, so I'm in a different time zone. Sorry, I need to at 2 on the radical French tradition. So if you'd like to attend that, the link is in the chat. If you have any other questions for the speakers, you can always email us at marxseminaradmin@riseup.net. And I will now end the session and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.